where one of the ways that Ukraine, for example, have been able to knock down the Iranian supplied or Iranian model Shaheds is with the White Stork program, which was the technological underpinning an idea of Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, the desire to supply Ukraine with a cheap number of AI guided attack and interceptor drones, which is very asymmetric, and they might only cost a few $100s to knock down very expensive Shahed systems.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now today on day 1441, I never thought I'd ever hear myself say that, of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation or full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We're very fortunate to be talking once again to Major General Chip Chapman. Chip is a former British Army commander, author of Notes from a Small Military, and a regular commentator on defence and security matters, and an old friend of the show. Chip, welcome back to Frontline.
Good afternoon, Philip.
Interesting times at the minute because Ukraine seems to have disappeared off the headlines completely. But as we're recording this in Abu Dhabi, there are peace talks are resuming this week. And these are US brokered talks. There's still the usual toing and froing saying we're making progress and things are going forward. Do you think it's going to amount to anything?
No. So it is a milestone, I think, that we're in a trilateral setting. But I think if you wrap up everything that's kind of happened in the last 10 days and put it within the DIME paradigm, and for the viewers, that's the way that the Americans look at the instruments of national power, diplomatic, information, military, and economic to achieve your national objectives, then we can see all of those in play from the Russian side. And I think that's why you can wrap certainly the non-ceasefire, as it seems to me, within that, because this partial ceasefire that we sort of seem to have brokered apparently by Trump wasn't really that. And indeed, it was just really a tactical pause, and overnight on the 2nd and 3rd of February, we now seem to have seen, according to Zelensky, the largest number of cruise missiles and ballistic missiles used in the war, not the largest number in terms of the overall number of drones, ballistic missiles and cruise missiles used. So during the non-ceasefire, they've really just stockpiled stuff to use on the sort of clout, don't dribble method that we always talk about. And of course, they've done that overnight on the coldest day of the year. So I don't think we've really got anywhere. But let's sort of break some of those apart and therefore look at it really. So the partial ceasefire, as I see it, is not really a concession. It's a signal, and there are three signals behind that. The first one is we are reasonable if Ukraine accepts our core demands. Rubbish, but that's the way that they will see it. Secondly, that we can turn the violence on and off. And thirdly, Trump can sort of say that there is progress and that it's Ukraine that's the blocker. And only if they would only concede the Donbass, and we keep now quoting it's the size of Delaware. I'm not sure why they do that, because America would never concede Delaware to anyone. Then peace could be cemented. And that is the problem, I think, at the moment, that they're talking about land, the Americans, and indeed when when Trump was talking about the Gaza sort of situation, one of the phrases he used there was that I look at things through a real estate prism, and that is the real problem. This is not about real estate and territory, a land swap. This is about sovereignty from a Ukrainian perspective, and oil and water don't really meet. And that's the problem we've really got at the moment. So Russia will maintain its position of no concessions. America and Russia, in terms of the military and information domains, will maintain the pressure. And they hope that the reward is some sort of peace. And I don't think Trump really cares what that sort of peace is, just so he can wave a piece of paper and try and get a Nobel Peace Prize. Well, Ukraine suffers. But all this has to be, again, wrapped up then with the Russian intent, which is to have sustained offensive operations at the front and blackouts in the rear, hoping that it can break the Ukrainian will and force it to accept the Russian terms. There is also the sticking point because the Russian terms are still maximalist. It's not just, this notion from Dmitriev that the path of peace is conceding Donbass. It is far wider than that. It's all that stuff about denazification and demilitarization, aiming to break Ukrainian sovereignty and culture. That doesn't mean it would be next year, but you don't concede your vital ground in military terms, which is what the Donbass would be with the fortress cities, particularly of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, which would give your enemy the tactical ability to come again at a time and place of their choosing.
But, once again, we're seeing Donald Trump being humiliated. He turned around and said when he introduced this sort of pseudo ceasefire that there would be no rockets or attacks until at least the 5th of February. And as you quite rightly described, we've had one of the largest ballistic and cruise missile attacks on Kyiv on the coldest night, or across Ukraine on the coldest night of the year. We've also seen, in recent days, a drone attack on a bus in Dnipropetrovsk, which killed 12 miners. We've seen a civilian train being struck in Kharkiv. Is Putin deliberately trying to push the boundaries with Trump to see how far he can get? And why do you think Trump isn't responding and going, hang on, you're not keeping up to your side of the bargain. I'm going to come down hard on you.
Well, no one knows the mercurial mind of Donald Trump, and I think that's the problem. It seems to me that one of the key things I thought would be the key things was Lindsey Graham on the 6th of January saying that Trump had greenlit the sledgehammer sanctions at 500%. That would be very impactful on Russia in the same way that what could be impactful today is seemingly that the Americans have done a tariff deal with India, bringing the tariff down from 50% to 18%, and looking to not sell Russian oil to India, and that oil being replaced by Venezuelan oil, for example. That could be impactful. But it's almost at the moment that we've got to the point where it's a sort of rerun of the November position where from Trump's perspective, it was, you've got 1 week to settle. So what would be interesting, I think, in Abu Dhabi this week is, again, whether it is give Donbass or there'll be no security guarantees. That seems to be the way the Americans are going at the moment. Again, part of that pressure strategy to reward Russia and get Ukraine to concede. We're no further down that line of trying to unblock that. And that's, as I said, to my mind, this is not a issue of land. It's that fundamental issue about sovereignty. But I think that is, of course, the real macro geopolitical problem that Trump doesn't really look at things in terms of sovereignty. That's why we've had all the nonsense about Canada as the 51st state. And, Greenland is, I'll invade Greenland and it'll become the 52nd state. I mean, it's just, the chicken bones of the international order have been sort of thrown in the air. We're not quite sure where they're going to come down in the future. What we do know, of course, is that hard power matters. And that's what both Donald Trump and Putin have really shown in the last few years.
Well, hard power in terms of security guarantees is something that will be vital to Ukraine should it sign up to any peace agreement. And some of the detail that I've seen being discussed today and how accurate this is, I'm not sure. But it was talking of if there was a ceasefire and a peace agreement, if it was broken by one side or the other, then there'd be a stiff letter sent as the initial reaction. Then the second bit would be the military forces on the ground from the peacekeeping or peace monitoring or peace enforcement. Nobody's decided what the mission is. Forces would then take action, and only on the third day or 72 hours and beyond, if the action was sustained, would America then become involved in any sort of peace enforcement and therefore underpinning any security guarantee. Do you think we could trust the Americans?
Well, I think you need to get to some sort of position where you have this tiering of the security guarantees. And essentially, we know from the previous negotiations, there's slightly more detail as you described there, Philip, but there's three layers. The first one is the Ukrainian armed forces, and that's why they won't accept any caveat on the size. There were this previous notion in negotiations that they would go down to a pretty small number, but now we're talking about 800,000, with the second tier being the coalition of the willing and the third tier being the Americans. Can you trust the Americans? Under Trump, that is really difficult to do. And there's one concept in international relations called rebus sic stantibus, which is you can abrogate any treaty if it's not in your interest. And of course, Trump has broken a number of treaties when he's been president, the top three really, one of which is actually potentially coming back to haunt him at the moment. So the top three are the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. He was the one who rescinded the agreement to limit the enrichment potential of the Iranian nuclear program. The second one was the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces, and the third one was under T1. He came out of the Paris climate change agreement. Biden went in. He's also rescinded that in his second term. So he's not got a great track record. So, like most of the things, when you meet someone, you ask yourself two questions: do I like this person, and do I trust this person? You might sort of think Trump is a sort of out of thigh slap man. What an interesting guy he is, but would you trust him? It's difficult at the moment to say you would absolutely. Now, one would hope there are systems behind Trump which would caveat that. Particularly, I think what we're going to see this year is some of the what falls out between the power of the executive and the power of the legislative, and where the power really does lie. Because, of course, at the moment it's being concentrated in the executive in the form of Trump. But I think we'll get an indication of that this month when one of the recurring security forums that we always look to. We've already had the sort of Davos in terms of the economic one, where we had a rambling speech by Trump. The one to look for this month is the Munich Munich security arrangement, which is from the 13th to 15th of February this year. We don't actually know yet who's going from the American perspective, but it's whether we're going to get another sort of telling off by Vance or someone like Vance as we had last year, and where that therefore leaves Ukraine and Europe for the future.
Well, the one thing we know it'll lead is starting the fifth year of this particular conflict. And if we look at the Russian casualties at the moment, the Center for Strategic and International Studies releasing the data, and it's very similar to the data we're getting out of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, suggests that today, as we're recording this, Russian casualties are about to reach 1.25 million. How do you think Putin is managing to get away with those sorts of numbers when a small fraction of that is what forced the Russians out of Afghanistan?
Well, I think I've read their report, and there's some really, really interesting lines in it, and things that you sort of scratch your head about. The longest conflict waged by Russia since the 17th century. Only World War One and World War Two are now more costly in modern Russian or Soviet history, and an inglorious ratio of losses to gains, a sort of phrase that stood out for me. And that's what we know, of course, the sort of the glacial progress they make for the return on losses is huge and probably not sustainable. And we say that's not sustainable because we know that in 2025 they met their remit of recruiting 409,000 people. That is the same number of people that they want to recruit this year. That doesn't give them a strategic reserve. It just fills the ORBAT, or the order of battle, where they are on the ground. Therefore, they don't have the ability to have fundamental new offensive operations at scale unless they take rob Peter to pay Paul, which of course also gives opportunities to Ukraine. How can they sustain that, and why is that possible? Well, I think we've spoken many times about what means that why do wars stop, and one of the reasons, of course, is the population, as they did in Afghanistan with the sort of the white widows or Russian widows coming out in force. That's really altered. So we now have a Russian population. This also is in the Center for Strategic and International Studies paper that is politically passive, heavily policed, and dissent has been dismantled under the 25 years of authoritarian dictatorship of Putin. And I think that's also an interesting one when we look at what is, for example, going on in Iran with the sort of internet kill switch being put there and the sort of only real sort of partial intranet being used in Iran. And that is the same sort of thing that Russia's been able to do or can do. So you're not going to have this sort of defection of the population revolting against this at the moment. There's no sign that the military is also in a position to revolt. And we've certainly seen no elite defection from those in the coterie that surround Putin. So it still seems fairly secure at the moment. Now, I've also said a number of times, though, that a tight grip is not necessarily the same as a stable grip. And we really don't know, I think, how fragile things are on the economic line for the Russians. How fragile really is that? Can they sustain their operations for a number of years still? Now, again, in my view, we don't know the answer to that because of the variables about support from outside agencies, including China. If you can break some of that, and maybe the oil going to India will be part of that breakage, then you're talking about different variables which may alter the calculus for Putin. But at the moment, he will keep going, and he still thinks he will be successful. He has no desire to end the war. Neither does he think he's under sufficient pressure from America, who are probably the only ones who could do it, to do so.
Well, it's interesting you say the economic pressure. Today, the Russian newspapers were talking about an increase in Russian businesses having difficulties in financing their business operations, and more and more beginning to openly complain about the financial position that they're in with the sanctions biting, but the cost of producing anything. Putin's managing to keep a lid on that. But this has to be, if we measure it from Russian advances, historically, one of the slowest operations that Russia has ever been engaged in, and they've achieved less than any Russian military in history.
That is probably true, but then one of the great questions we were always taught in the military, Philip, as you know, is so what? And if they can win at the diplomatic battlefield, they're given things by America, then they won't really care about that. And of course, what we have to remember is that diplomacy, if it enables them to do that, is a way towards their end, which is their peace as they see it, the successful peace, to achieve their national objectives. And that is still their maximalist objectives. If they can do that, then they can have a form of victory in the way that they sell the narrative, which means that the trade-off between distance and loss doesn't really matter. If you can say we've gathered people up, Mother Russia has expanded in the 4 oblasts that they're currently operating, and it's probably not the end. And certainly American intelligence in late December sort of said that they wouldn't stop. That doesn't mean that we're talking about a future war in 2 weeks, 2 months, or whatever. But the psychological underpinning of this particular regime, and probably those who would follow Putin, is still one of a maximalist Russia, an imperialist Russia, which still wants to gather in the former Soviet states from 45 and have this, regain lost territory and spheres of influence as they see it.
Oh, it's quite clear if Russia is given the salami that it's sliced away from Ukraine now, it'll just come back for further salami slices at some stage in the future. But we're into the 5th year. You talked about the 400 plus thousand Russians being called up and everything else. From a military perspective, how are the Russians going to properly train these people to get into the front line or to bring them into the military? Because all of their trained and experienced commanders will have probably been killed by now, given the huge numbers that are there. So they're getting an increasingly diluted pool of people to train the next lot that come in. That's then becoming more and more diluted from real military experiences. Is that why we're seeing the lack of armored tactics, the lack of what we'd recognize as combined arms tactics, difficulty in operating bits of equipment and all the rest of it on the front line?
Yeah, I think that's certainly a part of it. One of the things, certainly from a sort of German perspective in World War II, we often talk about the German army being tactically the most successful army in World War II, irrelevant if you don't have the linkage between operations and strategy. But you shouldn't compromise on training. You need to train your soldiers for a sufficient length of time so that they are fit to go into the field and take their place in an order of battle, fully trained. You just can't put them in half trained with no sort of psychological preparation and expect to have great things. I think that's part of the reason that we and not seeing sort of large combined arms tactics, but also, of course, we've really hit the sort of drone wall in terms of the 0 to 20 kilometres in what you and I would both know as the forward line of own troops forward, the flot forward, is dominated by sort of recce strike capability, which is now in the hands of ubiquitous drones, and that seems to be the real caveat at the moment. Now, that's not to say that I think that drone warfare is the way necessarily for the future just by itself. It just means you need to integrate things together properly if you're going to operate. And part of the reason for that is, of course, from 100 years ago, Fuller's theory of war is for every action there's a counteraction. That's why we're seeing the fact that electronic warfare has proliferated. From that, we've now gone back to sort of fiber optic guided drones, which can't be hacked, and therefore the only caveat on them has been the length of the cable spool, 10 to 20 kilometers. So you really don't know what this means. We have this endless debate about the nature of war doesn't change, which it doesn't. It's horrific. People get killed. It creates a lot of damage. But has the character of war really changed? Are we having a revolution in military affairs? Well, we might be, but it's probably not good enough to tell at the moment. I think one of the real differences, it seems to me, and maybe this is where the character of has fundamentally changed, is we used to talk about the military industrial complex. I think now we can talk more of the military technological complex. And I say that really partly from the drone perspective as well, where one of the ways that Ukraine, for example, have been able to knock down the Iranian supplied or Iranian model Shaheds is with the White Stork program, which was the technological underpinning and idea of Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, the desire to supply Ukraine with a cheap number of AI guided attack and interceptor drones, which is very asymmetric, and they might only cost a few $100s to knock down very expensive Shahed systems. And it's that technological power, along with the targeting, we've seen sort of before the war started, how 18 Airborne Corps, certainly from 2018, used the sort of power of AI and Palantir getting involved. So there's a number of companies where this sort of military technological complex has been developing in a close relationship between defence and them. I don't see that being changing for the future. And as I think I said before, the two key determinants for the future here are innovation and adaptation. It seems to me that it's been Ukraine and some of those European and US companies which have enabled Ukraine to do that pretty fast and pretty well.
But the technology of war and the discussion of technology in the war gives the civilian population who've never experienced war this feeling that it's a bit like your online game and you can reset and everything else. It's all about the technology. You've been, and I say this fairly frequently, you've been in the Falklands where our troops had to fix bayonets and to attack the Argentinian enemy at the time with bayonets because they'd run out of ammunition. We saw in Iraq British troops having to fix bayonets and attack the insurgents with their bayonets. Warfare is just still that guttural level. where you're getting different layers of technology and advancements coming in that make it even more and more complex. Can you give the listeners out there and those that are watching a flavor for what it's like from your experience?
Well, one of the I'll use a bit of history first, because one of the things that they said after the First World War is the infanteer is redundant, because the infantry took the largest and hugest number of casualties in any of the arms of war. Of course, that's absolutely nonsense, and it still is nonsense. It was nonsense in the Falklands and the Gulf War and everyone since. Because if you desire to take an occupied ground, ultimately, you cannot do that with machines. You need to do that with men and boots on the ground. And that's why that phrase of boots on the ground still means so much. And why, both from a Russian perspective and probably a European perspective in the future, mass still matters. You can have as much technology as you want, which may help you to defend. But if you desire to take that ground, then you need men on the ground. That is why I think, for example, the notion that America in Iran can knock the regime over by themselves without any boots on the ground won't necessarily work. And this was, of course, one of General Mark Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in America's 5 maxims of war we need to get rid of which one is the notion that you can win wars from afar just by dropping ordnance. You can't. You need people to follow that ordnance up, either from the civilian population who are going to revolt in Iran, hopefully, and be supported, or by people who will close with and engage the enemy and ultimately defeat them.
Well, Chip, getting into that level of tactical discussion, I think there's possibly a program in the future where we can look at the tactics that'll come out and holding ground. I do remember reading that the Ukrainians had a ground-based drone with a machine gun on it that seems to have held a piece of ground for a couple of weeks. Maybe there are changes afoot that we can look at in more detail in the future. But Major General Chip Chapman, it's been a real pleasure talking to you again on Frontline today.
Always good to see you, Philip.